We're very honored to have here with us, joining from Los Angeles, Thom Mayne, who of course needs a little introduction. He was a close friend of Michael Sorkin, founded Morphosis in 1972 as a collective practice of architecture, urbanism, and design. And with Morphosis has worked globally across a broad range of project types and skills that include projects you all know, such as the Bloomberg Center at Cornell Tech, or here the Cooper Union in the city. But like Sorkin, also very much an educator. As you'll know, Thom Mayne helped establish SciArc in 1972, and since then has held teaching positions here at Columbia, at Yale, Harvard, the Berlage, the Bartlett, many other institutions around the world, and has won many awards, including, of course, the Pritzker Prize and the AIA Gold Medal. And we're also incredibly honored to have James Wines here today, who, like Thom, I also don't think needs any introduction, was a very close friend of Michael Sorkin as well. Is an artist and environmental designer and the founder of SITE, Sculpture in the Environment, established in 1970. Is that correct? Yeah, 1970. And with SITE, James produced and is producing key projects in thinking about the environment and ecology, which of course includes SITE's radical de-architecture projects and the incredible best product showrooms that we all know of the 1970s. And throughout his career, Wines has advocated for sustainable design and the integration of nature and architecture, and his work spans public art, urban planning, writing, and architectural experimentation. So we'll hear from Thom Mayne first, and then from James Wines, and then after that we'll have a conversation, and we can open it up to everyone as well. Yes, please, Thom.
Terrific. Am I mic? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. It's been 6 years. When I was invited here, it made me kind of rethink my whole relationship with Michael and what took place. And it kind of necessitated it took me someplace, and I had to really spend some time with it. And so I wanted to start today's conversation that I've written a letter to Michael, and it goes something like this. Dear Michael, the windmill stands, its stone blade mechanism. It grinds grain. That's what it is. And yet someone else sees a giant, and in seeing it reveals something the practical world cannot, that every object contains within it another object, its fictional shadow, without which it remains incomplete. Cervantes understood that the real and the imagined are not opposites but layers, each requiring the other to be fully seen. And yet Cervantes is not done with us. The fool is not celebrated in that book. He is exposed. And in being exposed, he reveals the universal condition that we cannot accept the windmill's indifference to human meaning. We require the giant. We require the fiction. The part of us that insists the ordinary must carry extraordinary weight, unable to see the ordinary as merely ordinary, compelled to project meaning into mechanism, into stone, into the city itself. And yet what keeps Cervantes honest, what keeps the whole beautiful argument from floating away is something much simpler. Quixote and Sancho share a meal, manchego cheese, rough bread, a flask of wine passed between them on the road. The most ordinary thing. And in that moment, the knight errant and the peasant are just two people eating, equally hungry, equally human, the giant and the windmill temporarily at rest. Cervantes never lets you forget that. However far the vision reaches, however sharp the criticism, the shared table is where both of them simply live. This is where you live, Michael. Sorry. Your criticism, name what the city was. Your architecture, reach for what it could be. Reach for the other city, the shadow one, the one Calvino would have recognized, the one that insists on being seen inside the practical one. Sancho and Quixote were never enemies. They needed each other to complete the journey. And what bound them was not ideology or vision, but something far more basic, the shared road, the shared meal, the recognition that however differently they saw the world, they were moving together through it. You carried both registers simultaneously. As a critic, as an architect, your prose, your work never pretended they were fully reconciled, because they weren't. You were Sancho Panza as a moral witness. Your criticism saw the windmill for exactly what it was, the mechanisms of power, capital, and planning ideology that dismantled the city's human compact. And you named them with the fury that never softened, that relentlessness, never contrarianism. It was courage, the willingness to absorb the professional costs of saying plainly what others dressed in euphemism. And because you never stopped, because the criticism was utterly consistent for decades, it accumulated into something beyond critique. It became a moral position, a fixed point by which the city measures its own betrayals. You became the conscience of American urbanism, the one voice that couldn't be absorbed, co-opted, or silenced by the very institutions that you challenged. This critical intellect, this critical intellect demanded skepticism, this dismantling of false premises, fundamentally a subtractive operation. Architecture requires a kind of productive naivete, a willingness to commit to a proposition before all the evidence is in, to bet on a formal or a spatial idea that cannot be fully justified in advance. To make something, to truly make it, requires an emotional recklessness, the willingness to be wrong. You live that tension daily, your critical voice, protection, and prison simultaneously. The tension between your role as critic and your work as architect was not a contradiction, it was the argument. It's what you left us, and you never lost sight of that shared table. The windmill stands, it grinds again, and somewhere inside it, because you insisted, the giant still moves. Missing your presence, Sorkin.
Well, am I speak now? Yeah, okay. First of all, I want to compliment Bart and the university for organizing this in the first place, because I looked at the exhibition and it's superb because it captures exactly Michael's kind of collage of information, the flow, contradictions, and so it's a real genuine tribute all the way around. And Michael and I, in the good old days, often were on symposia or lecturing together or something of that nature. And I remember at that time, there was always a controversy. We were always a center of, we always said something that was controversial and whatever. And I remember that thinking that now his New Jerusalem is so relevant in a whole different dimension that I miss him desperately just to talk about what would those changes in the world. But I remember when Michael and I would give one of these things and we would be battling back and forth. We often argued about things. And then finally, it was that time when there was lots of radical youth and some kid in the audience would stand up and say, all architecture is shit, people that count. And the whole audience would applaud. There was roars of applause. And I thought I kind of miss all that in a way because it did have a kind of special energy that is lacking a lot in dialogues today, but hopefully can be resurrected. In thinking back with, I think that, there's so many eloquent things that have been said already about Michael, but I think the specific thing that I treasure the most is the flexibility of his thinking, the fact that he could go around the subject in incredible eloquence and cover it from both sides. And even if it was being critical, even if it was a critical essay and taking somebody to task in the essay or in his lectures, he always had a generosity of spirit. He always had a gentleness that somehow it wasn't, you didn't take offense. You thought about it. You thought about it in depth and what he was really saying, what he was really telling you. And another thing is his masterful command of audiences. God forbid you had to be on the same podium with Michael. I mean, there was no competition, and you could only hope that your message got through or whatever, because his sheer eloquence went beyond that. And I remember one time we were lecturing, I think it was in Torino, in Italy, and we were on the same podium, one following the other. And I don't know how you feel about it, but I have a feeling high tech released itself on the world too early. I don't know about your computer, but nothing works ever. So it was that day when they were saying auditoriums were becoming high tech. And I remember we got an announcement from Italy that this is state of the art. State of the art is the kiss of death. Absolutely. That meant everything. What can go wrong will go wrong. So the first speaker, there were three speakers. Michael was second, I was third. Okay, the first speaker stood up. Nothing worked. The sound didn't work. The vision didn't work. Nothing. There were lots of little people crawling under tables, trying to figure out where to plug it in. And I often thought, just about technology, it did set itself free on the world a little too early. I mean, in the horse and buggy days, let's face it, they had managed over a few thousand years to get the horse in some kind of mode where he actually performed. You could trust the horse. Well, anyway, so back to this conference, Michael was second. Well, sure, they got things a little bit working at the end of the first speaker's lecture, cleared a little bit. Then Michael's turn came. And of course, well, first of all, the sound didn't work. And then they got some visuals, and the visuals went on for 4 minutes, 5 minutes, then the visuals went on. Then the sound came back on. And Michael was just, with his triple aplomb and kind of radiance and ability to handle situations, said, oh, okay. What I'll do is I will describe my slides, and then I'll comment on them. So he started the lecture literally describing what you're seeing in each slide. You didn't see any vision, you just heard the voice. And this went on for about 10 minutes, and suddenly the images came on again, and then the images went off again. And so Michael just said, oh, fuck this. And the whole audience screamed with applause, of course. Fuck this. I'll just continue to describe my lecture. So he gave this masterful lecture describing what you're seeing what you shouldn't be seeing on the screen. But that, I think, sets, for me, the kind of character, the kind of, not only the charisma, but the ability to handle situations and the ability to think things through completely. I use Oscar Wilde's phrase, an idea that isn't dangerous isn't worthy of being called an idea. And in almost every lecture, because I think that's exactly what Michael did. He always put things inside and outside and so forth. Well, anyway, as we continue today, I want to say one thing. I'm very old, 93 now, and so I do have memory problems, all kinds of things. But if I say anything today, I remember again going back to Michael and our relationship. We'd always say, well, what do we say something controversial? We're going to have to argue with the audience here. Well, I can say I'm 93. Anything I say that you don't like today, you can attribute to senility. That's it. And so I pass the main responsibility on to Thom here. By the way, Thom, I think 82. Are you 82?
Plus minus.
Well, I'm 93, so compared to me, he's like prepubescent in my whole attitude. So you have to carry it. So from now on, anything I say, if it offends you, I'm off the hook. And so take it over.
I started that because I never had a chance to say goodbye to Michael. But I'm going to turn it around now very quickly. And Joan, he was one of the people I truly loved. Okay, change the mood. The show, I just saw the show, and so I wrote this through my own notion of who this guy is. But I think from even the beginning of the discussion, I think it's going to be really kind of a very different show to analyze. And that to talk about the work in traditional terms, comparing it to architecture within the moment, I think would be unfortunate. And then I think the key to this, and what I tried to say in my piece, my letter to him, is that I think we're looking at an extremely kind of unique kind of character where the relationship between the words and his expression of ideas and thinking through writing and his expansion or thinking or questioning through his work had a very complex connection. And looking at Bernard, architects are very tough on each other as architects. And if you were going to look at the work in purely architectural terms, it would be a tough decision, a tough conversation. But I think there'd be a complete misreading of understanding the nature of the work. They would have to understand it within extremely different terms to have any meaning at the work you're looking at. We disagreed on just about everything, it seemed like. We did nothing but kind of argue our whole time, but we were asking questions and we were investigating the nature of what we call architecture. But I think in the case of the work as I look at it, that it has some complex relationship, and I mentioned in my letter to him that there was a contradiction and it was unresolved, and I would claim it is unresolved. That the things you're looking at are about interrogation. They're about the questioning of somebody that's willing to do that relentlessly and at great cost professionally or personally, right? By the way, our academic institutions, supposedly liberal institutions, were frightened by him. We had many talks over decades that he couldn't get a job as a dean or a chairman because they were frightened of him because he was so blunt. He was so relentlessly honest, right? And I mentioned in my letter to him that honesty would have a huge effect on your work. And that it's funny, as I was reiterating my conversations with him and as I was writing this, it brought up so many kind of past conversations and going way back to our early development. And it occurred to me how incredibly important a certain naive, a kind of an absurd, optimistic naivete is a part of your beginning. Where if you're if you have a cystic critique, it just wouldn't allow you to move forward. Because you have to be able to look like a fool. You have to make enormous mistakes and stumble. If you're actually innovating, if you're asking questions through the work, right? Meaning you're concretizing it, you're now taking responsibility within the community, and it's a very, very different kind of notion, right? And he was on this notion, he could operate in these both terms, and somehow that was Michael. But I think there was another part of him, going back 3 or 4 decades, that clearly he was an ethical conscious of the profession. And as I talked to various people, even recently, all of us say the same thing. Oh, there just he's a hard person to replace, and there's no other Michael. And he clearly, in my mind, came from, in my beginning of my career, I'm looking at Hayek, and I'm looking at Lebbeus, and later got to know Lebbeus personally. And in some ways, they were the Joseph Boys of architecture. They produced an ethical condition that I look back now that were incredibly important people that, to start with, understood architecture as a political act, especially in the U.S. where it's not understood. I'd say most young people don't understand architecture as a political act, which is kind of a sad phenomenon. And he was a character that absolutely kind of dug into that position. And it made him rare for that point. And then with that, his, again, I tried to mention the Montego cheese. He had an immense sense of humor and a humanity. You could just go right after him and he'd laugh and smile, and we could go at it. And it'd be, it gave you a unique kind of intimacy within a collegial sense, that you could go any place you wanted to go and you could feel comfortable that you're going to get a straight up answer. You can go head to head with this character. But there was a sense of humor about it, right? There was a humor.
Incredible.
That made him a really, really rare character.
The great relief factor. I remember that. I mean, he would
Absolutely.
just when you turn a phrase around or take something that was almost too serious and tense or something apocalyptic, and he could turn it around so that you could almost rethink it as a reader, as an audience, rethink it and say, well, it always has two sides. And it was invariably in all of his writing that there was always another argument. And he gave you that ground. When we would lecture together, it was very funny because I always just told Michael, I said, look, you're the big planner, you do the big plan, and you do the height. And I'm an environmental artist, so I'll just talk about what's under your feet. And we had a good relationship. That's exactly what we did. I talked very much about what's it like to walk over something or sit on something or just experience it psychologically. The one thing we both agreed with, though, was that architecture is not just a formal strategy, it's not a form, function, space. It's all of those things, of course. But like theater or like any other art form, it's a collective art. A lot of people perform it. But the final result does engage psychology of situation, context, thoughts about things, changing your mind. And that's somehow, when those qualities enter architecture, when they become a part of the kind of all over ambiguity, it becomes more interesting. It becomes more long-lasting. I mean, I just say I worked a little bit on that book, the New Jerusalem, with it. I did a kind of a chapter in there, kind of a sketch chapter. But I remember talking to him about it and in the development of that that he really saw the catastrophe that, for 2,000 years, three religions hated each other because they all went back to the same premise: my God is better than your God's a phony. And so this thing went on for centuries and centuries. But Michael managed to write about it, select other writers, think about what does this all really mean? What is this? And in a sense, it takes into account different religions, and without really trashing them or criticizing them, it says, you can get along. It sounds like a very simple, obvious statement, but there are avenues, there are possibilities, there are ways that it could be much better. And I think that's the highest tribute. I try to think that. Well, there was I've said this several times. I've given tributes to important people, really important people, and 2 or 3 times I mentioned this as a guideline in a way. And it was Michael was a unique figure. He could write better than anyone I could ever think of, but it was this substance and the depth and the humor and everything. And so I remember it was a tribute being given to very late in life to Orson Welles. And, all the speakers stood up, and it was in Hollywood. It was a huge ceremony, lifetime achievement sort of event. And everybody spoke very eloquently of Orson Welles' style and his influence on cinema and theater and everything. And it was very interesting. At the very end of it, Martin Scorsese stood up, just looked at the audience quietly. He said, Orson Welles, he reminds us of no one. And I thought that's the highest compliment you could ever pay an artist. He reminds us of no one. And when you think of a figure like that, and I attribute it also to Vito Acconci, who was a great friend of mine. And there was something about the eloquence of his work and the complexity and he hated repeating himself. You were always being asked to, do another one like the one you did before. So I think that it's the kind of brain that Michael brought to architecture and art, almost anything he wrote about really, that is unique. It's above. It's kind of above criticism in many ways. It's a voice of its own.
It's funny, we grew up together too. It's funny, when I was working on this, I was thinking of the manchego cheese wine part, and the first thing that came to my mind was Pesce's chair, the one that opens up. That was my bedroom. When we met, we're all dead broke.
Yeah.
When I come to New York, he's putting me up, and I get to sleep in the Pesce chair.
Yeah.
Or Lori's putting me up at her place. Or Stephen Hall's not here. He's putting me up. I mean, that's the way we were at that for about a decade, I think, right? And so it's impossible to disconnect the most personal kind of things going on and the dialogue and before we get to Exquisite Corpse, or discuss the nature of his writing or his interest in the collective notion of ideas, actually, that comes out of an Exquisite Corpse, which is, for me, of course, interesting. That architecture isn't a singular act, it's a collective act, and he was very much interested in that, and it was always part of our conversation, right? Did you intend to go to any particular place in a more...
I was really hoping to now open it up to everyone. Of course, I have questions like maybe James. Before we do that, I want to ask one specific question, which is that Michael also edited a book of yours. Is that correct?
I'm sorry?
Michael also edited.
Oh,
a
yeah.
book of
Oh, you
yours.
want to tell that story?
I wanted, well, maybe to tell the process, like as
it's a funny story. I was writing this book called De-Architecture, and it was really because there wasn't, I thought, sufficient information about environmental art at that time. So I thought I would kind of weave art and architecture, and it was called De-Architecture. So, and Kate Norman, who's a wonderful editor, I think it was from Rizzoli or something. Anyway, she came one night and said, "Okay, I'm going to read through it, James, and we'll say it." So, as she's reading, whole pages go on the floor. She's tossing pages of my text out, and I'm going berserk. You're destroying my book. You're going to destroy my book. And I said, I called Michael. It was like midnight almost or something. I said, Michael, you got to come over and save me. This woman is destroying my book. And so, Michael said, can't we do it tomorrow? No, it's got to be now. She's here now. So poor Michael drags himself over to my loft in Soho, and he said, James, would you just let me talk with Kate? We'll talk. And maybe you go have a coffee or something, and then come back. And so I left for about a half hour almost, and I came back, and Michael just looked at me, James, she's right. So half the book went down the drain, but and Kate Norman and both Michael had this wonderful way of when you had some convoluted sentence or something that didn't go anywhere. And Kate and Michael both say, well, what did you really want to say here? And then you say 10 words. Okay, that's all you have to say. So there are many. I have endless personal stories. I'm sure Thom does too, of just his insights, his capacity to educate you, really. I think that of people I knew over my life, he was a godsend of education, of just how to think, how to arrive at ideas, how to handle them. And as I said, he was one of the very few critics, so you call him a critic, who could write a criticism, and the person being criticized could end up not only thinking in depth about themselves, but they also didn't dislike or hate Michael for writing a negative review, and that's a really special quality.
How would you describe, as he asked questions, they didn't have to come to a conclusion.
Yeah,
That's really important, right? They were just instigating further investigation, hugely important. Right? That they didn't, and I'm gonna go back to the show. I would say that'd be absolutely part of the discussion here. A bit different than maybe as a pure architect, because I look at it and go, I'm going to be very insistent on coming to a conclusion, and I don't have a choice in a way, because I have to conclude it as I concretize it, as I build it. Or as I, in pragmatic terms, invest huge capital and energy, et cetera, right? And so I don't have that choice. And I would have said that the show still discusses of somebody that is constantly in inquiry and is not demanding a solution based on who he is, working on conceptual work and writing. We're directly instigating the questions. And then with that would also be a little bit like Corbusier in his painting, could never quite accept certain love affairs and certain interests in certain people. And we had actually quite animated conversations because we all know each other, among those people, and going, we're digging in a little deeper and kind of more focused in a singular way, and don't have the choices that you have, Michael, right? That we have to kind of commit ourselves, and with that comes a different kind of an energy that requires that digging in, right? But again, I would think, especially if the students here, the young people, it would be really important to kind of, as you look at the show, it would be really, you'd have to evaluate it in a very, very different way than any typical notion of looking at architects' drawings and models. It would have to be deeply connected to the nature of how they were useful to this particular character and what he left us in terms of his thinking, his ideas. And then with that was, in terms of, I was talking with Eric just before I came here, that was the act of questioning and interrogation itself without some prescribed solution is incredibly rare.
Yeah.
That someone has taken on that kind of position. And with that comes now the manner of the character, both the humane character, the humor, and the incisiveness of his thinking, right, are unusual. And then of course add that the more ethical, the humanness that it's based on. And he's not somebody we need we need at this moment for sure, and kind of irreplaceable in my mind.
It's the question of openness that Andrei also mentioned that is central to so many of the projects. Is, I think, that relates very much to what you're.
And it's interesting, the fact that he didn't build buildings allowed him to kind of maintain certain positions that it might have been more difficult if he's constructing.
yeah,
It might be just about a requirement that he has to keep an openness in his work, meaning it's conceptual, to be who he is. I think he sensed, like it's funny, you mentioned Terreform. I never went to the office. We met at his, we met at his apartment, or we were at the Balthazar or something. And as I was listening to the first speakers, I'm going, I never really thought about that, but it was just kind of instinctive. I just didn't want to go to the studio because it wasn't going to be, not going to be useful for our dialogue and kind of where we stood. And it never occurred to me that, right? I'm going, you said that, I was going, that's weird. I talked about it a lot, and I was a supporter of it, right? So a lot of it, you just get instincts, you sense this, right?
I would really love to, since there's many people here. Well, first of all, thank you for the conversation. I would now love to ask people who have specific.
Bernard there is holding.
Bernard is already holds a microphone, so please, Bernard. Yes, yeah.
Okay, I want to pick up on something that Thom said about words and images. But first of all, to congratulate, Andrés for, sort of inviting the show and Bart-Jan for making a fantastic installation. And the installation is important because in many ways, to be able to touch upon this continuity between the words and the images was something it's never easy for any one of us, and was not easy for someone like, Michael, who was so good with words that at one moment he had almost to censor himself in order to get to the images. And I always found quite fascinating, by the way, a little footnote, amusing to remember that every uh, anybody that sort of mentioned sort of things in the past, at age 25, 28, everybody knew everybody else, which is very, so for you guys, you know that in this room, you're going to live with those guys forever.
You were at SciArc in 1974, 3.
73 with you, and probably 1 year earlier with Michael in London, by the way.
Right.
So the point that I want to make about the words and the images is that at one moment, again, my memory, and it may be flawed, Joan might know more than I do. At one moment, he says to himself, but I want to be an architect, and sort of takes a step back away from what he was so popular and so loved for, this ability to use words and really to encapsulate the mood of an era, right? The sort of counterculture mood. So he takes a big step and has to build up almost from scratch or from words, getting towards the images. And what I found fascinating with the installation of the show, it shows that there is actually a continuity. And that continuity, and I'm glad actually that you mentioned other heroes, John Haydock and a few others, that creates suddenly I'm going to use carefully the word narrative, a storyline which appears very, very strongly in the show with those various strange, unlikely objects which enter the realm, and there I use the word poetry, that are not quite, and as you say, it's not about building, it's about a much larger issue. And what fascinates me with Michael is that he was able to do that passage from the words to something which was not quite the expected, let's get the building done. So suddenly, the ability to do something which is somewhere halfway between the words and the images, which is a sort of transdisciplinary, dare I say, sort of sensibility, I find it quite wonderful, and I'm quite happy the show is taking place. And thanks you, James, because you've been also part of all that.
He was also struggling with the images show a certain direction in architecture, which was at odds with his egalitarian, democratic, Jane Jacobish part of his personality. And he was aware of that because we discussed that at times, that they were completely antagonistic because I was taking the consequences of producing work that had those characteristics and found it very difficult because the public had no interest in that work whatsoever, right? It was a very, very kind of private, considered kind of an elitist isolated kind of things. And so there was a tension that he was struggling with. And the characters that were interesting to him, starting with Lebbeus, led the most isolated of lives. They were most disconnected politically versus some of his political ambitions, the broader ambitions. And there was a huge tension of that. And it was just part of the nature. But I, instead of seeing it as, I was kind of worried about how to talk about it, but kind of this and make it into a critique. That tension was actually what he was about in a way. I lost my.
Yeah, maybe the mic a little bit.
Where'd it go?
It's good.
Yeah,
Am I
I
good again?
can't hear.
Yeah,
I hear.
no, that tension is what he was about, right? And it was the uniqueness of him, and it makes it, I think, much more difficult to evaluate the show myself.
Thank you, Bernard. It's I think there it is.
Oh, it's here.
Any other questions for Thom or James? And then what I would like to do now is to sort of, I think this Bernard in many ways sort of started it already. I know there's many people in the room here who knew Michael Sorkin personally. I'm looking at Christine, of course, and many others, and we have speakers coming up later. But I wanted to have the to give the opportunity, basically for some people who want to say something on Sorkin, on the work, whatever, to give that. And Elisabetta is here, of course. So I don't want to put you on the spot. I'm also looking at Graham.
Michael was my friend and colleague at City College, and when he invited me, kind invitation to come to the opening of the exhibition, I was frantic because I have not been very social in the last few years, and also because I didn't have really the time to mourn Michael properly. But when I came here, I forced myself and I entered the exhibition. I realized one thing, that it was the perfect exhibition. Why? Not because of the content only, but because it's exactly what Michael meant to live dangerously. So nobody that is not insane will install an exhibition with the models and everything's on the floor. Because it's clear that put Michael Sorkin in a box, in plexical box, would have been like to put him in a cage. And also, Michael was able to make people to do things that they would never have done in their life. So you walk around in terror the entire evening trying to tell people not to crash the model. And I think this is the image of how he pushed us to do something better, to do something unknown, to do something like, let's try it, without not knowing this. There is one book that I would like to say a few words about Michael Sorkin Library at City College. There is one book that is called Wiggle, and the book is from Monacelli in the 90s. And you know, today books have few pictures. They give us help to have less images, no color. This book is an explosion. There is not an inch of the book that is white. So the pictures are crawling from one page to the other. Is something wonderful. And I think Michael wrote these things about what does it mean wiggles. Fish are symmetrical, but only until they wiggle. Our effort is to measure the space between the fish and the wiggle. This is the study of a lifetime. And I think this is exactly the way Michael was. And the books are at City College, and they are a mine. They are full of notes, of post-its, of comments, dedications. So I have had the privilege, thanks to you, to pack the books during the COVID and bring it to City College. And I spent, everybody has terrible memory of COVID. I was there 3 days a week doing the catalog of the book. And of course, with no discipline, I spend more time reading than doing my job. So it was extended to a very long time. And I think is also we managed to keep the order that Michael wanted. So Michael put all these post-it on the bookshelves, trying to change the categories, and he has an endless list of the possible combination. So we try to keep the order Michael wanted, and at the same time the job of the Library of Congress have been done, but allowing us to keep the way Michael wanted. So I invite you to enjoy and coming up the hill to see the books.
Yeah, Elisabetta. Christine, can I put you on the spot? Yeah.
Well, let me stand up and face all of you. I haven't prepared anything. In fact, I just learned I was to say a few words. I know Michael, or knew Michael, from MIT days, so we were students together. And I am struck by the first slide that we saw today, which was make no small plans, but down a few lines was because your sons and your grandsons will make big plans. And I'm struck by that because Michael was my great promoter from MIT days forward. And in those days, believe me, women needed promotion and needed help in surviving in schools of architecture. So Michael and my paths crossed many times. I have always been writing a book called The Architecture School. It was my way of writing about the pain and difficulty of teaching as a woman in a school of architecture and being not recognized and being overlooked and so forth. Michael was always there. When I didn't get tenure at Columbia, I taught here for 8 years. There was a famous course at Cooper Union. I believe, Bernard, you taught it first, or at least an early one. You passed it on to Michael, and Michael passed it on to me. Well, that's not the usual line of passing things on. And I taught there for many, many times until Graham, I think you took over from that. So unusual, but the promotion was there. Michael was moving on, I think, to Vienna at the time. And there was always Michael. We would meet after a semester of my teaching and after his semester. We would always meet and talk about what had happened, what was going on in the world. And then my complaints were always the apoliticalness of architecture and getting great support from Michael, so that I would leave and I'd say, all right, it's worth keeping fighting, keeping going. If he wasn't there, I don't know, I might have dropped out long ago. But he was there, and he was there to ask me to write essay upon essay upon essay in his various books. I think it may have started with Jerusalem, I'm not sure. But Jerusalem, we met in Lago de Como, the Rockefeller Institute, which Michael had organized, and we all had a fantastically wonderful time talking, because we couldn't meet in Israel. So the Palestinians came, the non-Palestinians came. We had a wonderful time talking. It's the kind of event that Michael could create. And out of that came a book on Jerusalem. I'm not sure it's the same New Jerusalem. I think it's the second book on Jerusalem. Yeah. But anyway, and when Michael asked me, I said, well, Michael, I've never been to Jerusalem. I don't know what to write about Jerusalem. It's hard to write about cities that you don't know about. She said, oh, do your memory thing. And that's, so the memory of Jerusalem, in which the stories of three religions inventing their ideology about the city and how they used the city, was inspired by Michael. And he inspired me so many times to write an essay, yes, in the war book on military operations of an urban terrain. That was my finding, but Michael said, well, write about cities in war. So there was always a spark and always an influence, and I missed that a lot. That helped, that promotion. It's really important. It's not just sons and grandsons anymore. So.
Yes, Laura.
Okay, I remember Michael Sorkin from 1985 when he wrote in the Village Voice. So I just Googled it and I found something really appropriate, so I'm going to read it. Okay, Dump the Trump, it's called. And then at the what do you call it? The byline of the story is the centerpiece of the scheme. The 150-story erection is Trump's third go at the world's tallest building. Was a man ever more preoccupied with getting it up in public? It's Michael Sorkin. And then he says, great cities find their forms through compact. New York entrusts its destiny to deals. Donald Trump will direct the future of 77 acres of our most vital territory, not because he's in any way earned the privilege, but because he's paid for it. This is urbanism of the shooting gallery. Put your money down and take your shot. I refer to the young master builders' recently announced plans to build a television city on the old Penn Station rail yard stretching from 59th to 72nd Street along the Hudson. In case you missed the hype, Trump intends to put up the following: one 150-story world's tallest building, 6 76-story buildings, one 65-story building, and one 15-story building. These are to be filled with condos and offices and would sit on a titanic podium that would contain the eponymous TV production, there was television in those days, facilities, as well as department stores, shops, parking, and other mall amenities, all topped by 40 acres of what the press release describes as parks. The architect for the scheme is Bart-Jan of Chicago, a designer of particularly primitive sensibilities whose shallow insights and unfettered esprit de glee must have struck Trump as especially congenial. I can almost hear the conversation between them. Helmut, I like your style, says Trump. And Donald, I like your style, says Jan. The scheme is so stupid, my initial reaction is to think it's phony, a stalking horse for some marginally less barbaric proposal Trump is willing to trade to. Even in shrunken form, though, we haven't been treated to Towers in the Park proposal for quite some time. Anyway, it goes on. It's a short article, but I've always thought that someone should collect the articles that he wrote in the Village Voice, and I used to say that they was always at the end of the year, you know, the best of in architecture in all these newspapers, and I thought the Village Voice should have always done the worst of, and he would have written a really brilliant thing. But anyway, he was such a sort of a radical voice in those days, and it's just terrible that it's all the same people that he's criticizing from 1985 are still around.
Graham, can I put you on the spot?
I've been trying to avoid talking. I miss Michael every day. I still talk to him, and I talk to. I met him in 1971, I think, in the summer session in London that Alvin Boyarsky organized, and the next year I invited him to teach with me at the AA in the first year urban themed unit, and Bernard was around then too, and I think Thom and definitely Stephen Hall. So it's difficult. Like, I'm 81 now. He's been there 70 something years. I met him when I was very young, and our lives intertwined. Not only from the teaching, it's a very, very long story. I was around at MIT, and do you remember those studios where you could build yourself a nest inside a sort of superstructure inside the room? It was the messiest, most chaotic kind of construction, actually quite similar to what we look at. Self-constructed using junk. It was, and this was the studio. I can go on and on. Michael helped me enormously in a transition in my life where it's so complicated. I was in Boston for a girlfriend, and had a heartbreak hotel, and Michael helped me through. And then when I found a new partner, blessed me. And Joan was part of that whole process. And so it's very personal, and it goes on. When I wanted to write a book, he helped me enormously. He gave me his editor to edit my book. And this guy, I never met him. He was a scientist, and he wanted everything numbered and sequenced. And I couldn't imagine Michael working with him. But this was his secret sauce. He had this guy who'd worked for the Bell Telephone Labs, I guess through his father, a real scientist. Anyway, he helped me enormously produce my books. When I started teaching here, that was also another thing. And then when he started teaching urban design, he asked me to go there for 5 years, like starting a restaurant, to do the urban history course. And then he handed it over, not to Marshall Berman, or maybe, I can't remember. It was an incredible experience of being with him on that beginning. And he did this whole collage technique with the students of these collision collage workshop design studios where they had to write as well. And then he took that whole process to China and won competitions. And of course they stole, excuse me for Chinese students, they stole the designs, never paid him, and built it with not his name, but in the, anyway. And then we used to, as we got older, meet for lunch. But I would be there on time. He was always behind. So I'd study the library because it was all around me. And I know Elizabeth did a really beautiful job moving it. But I would be stuck in there for an hour or so. And he had all the magazines and everything. It was amazing. And then we got lunch around the corner for 2 hours. These two old gentlemen, slowly melting into the table. It was an incredible thing. I was supposed to go to lunch with him on the Wednesday he went to hospital, and I didn't go. I actually went upstate because it was midterm, but that was just heartbreak, another heartbreak. And so I can't see a way of writing. I mean, I love this whole meeting and people putting their voices forward. And somehow I can't find a way to do that in writing and pull it together. It's just too strong. But I really appreciate what's happening and the exhibition. Thank you.
Anybody else wants to say? I think it's 4, and we can move on to the next panel, which would be, sorry. Oh, and there's coffee apparently. And the next panel is Deen and Vyjayanthi will start and discuss the work with Terreform and urban research. Yeah. So we're gonna. Oh yes, yeah. Oh sorry. Yes.
Inclusive, but because we're talking about Michael, it's in the realm of ideas. Everybody in the room recognizes it's his ideas that were his power. And I just, from my own memory, I was studying art in the art school, and I think Ozenfeld came and gave a lecture on early 20th century Dada and Surrealism, and I'd never even heard of it. And I said, oh my God, this turned me on. What is all this stuff? So the next day I went and asked one of my teachers in the art school, I said, yeah, well, this Duchamp character, who's Duchamp? He said, oh, he's a marginal artist in Paris. The rest is history, of course. So the point is that Duchamp himself said, I'm really interested in ideas more than objects. And so he thought through everything, and when he had a good idea, boom, it exploded. Picasso, on the other hand, his counterpart, kind of overproduced. When he had a great idea, it was incredible, but a lot of the time it wasn't. So they're two different artists. They're both great and huge impact, and they're polar opposite in the whole spectrum. So I think more than anything else, Michael represents that pinnacle of ideas in the arts. And in fact, we used to discuss Dada and Surrealism and Duchamp quite a bit when we got together. And I think that those ideas, it takes time to crystallize. And it takes time before everybody realizes that these ideas have enormous influence, and they spread like wildfire once they catch on. And I think one would have to say that globally speaking now, in terms of visual art, probably Marcel Duchamp is a much more powerful influence and lasting influence than even Picasso. So I think we have to kind of end the evening by attributing the highest pinnacle to Michael, which was his capacity to deal with ideas.
But his uniqueness is he operated on both registers, very different than Duchamp. He was still looking at gluing. In fact, your Picasso and Duchamp,
Yeah.
he's gluing together those two, for sure. I would have said that's the unique thing of how you see the show, was his ability to operate on two registers, right?
Yeah, exactly. He had that quality.
Thank you, Thom. Thank you, James.
Very good.
Well, I think everybody should give us some applause to Bart for doing this. It was a very good idea. So have it for Bart.